Hello and welcome to Words in a Time of Lockdown, a podcast from the Writer's Block Cornwall, exploring creativity and creative writing in a time of change. The Writer's Block is the creative writing centre for Cornwall, and I'm Polly Roberts, a writer and member of the Writer's Block team. We hope you find some inspiration in what you hear. In today's podcast, I'm speaking with Clare Owen, the author of YA novel Zed and the Cormorants, along with Sophie Aldred, the voice of the audiobook. Clare is a writer and actor living in Cornwall. Zed and the Cormorants is her first YA novel, published by Arachne Press, April 2021. Sophie is best known for her role as Ace in Doctor Who. She has since performed in West End, been a voice artist for TV and audiobooks, and presented television shows. Hi Claire and hi Sophie. This is the first time we've got two people on the podcast, so really great to have you along. Thank you both for agreeing to come along.
It's a pleasure.
It's lovely to be here.
We're here namely because Claire has released her first book, Zed and the Cormorants. Claire, I'm really curious straight away diving into how was it to release a book during lockdown? It's been a mad time to release your first books. I'm guessing you haven't had much in-person input from that.
No, not yet. I've done a couple of, I've done one schools event, which was a little bit strange because everybody was in bubbles and it was a whole of year 8 trying to tie the book into their studies of the Gothic. But when I arrived, because they were all in these separate bubbles, sort of, set around this gymnasium, which was very loud and echoey, and they were all behind masks. So I couldn't really hear them, but I was walking around with a crackly microphone. So that was a bit logistically challenging.
Gosh, yeah.
But frankly, I was just grateful. We'd already delayed a year because it was meant to come out last April. So we set the date. And when it came to the launch, we realised it would have to be online. At least everybody's had a bit of practice at that now. So I think it was good to have left it that year because people are much more sort of, keen to come along to those sort of things, and it was easier to run it as well.
Gosh, that must have been crazy though, a year ago, kind of thinking if we leave this a year, we probably will be able to get it. And then a year later and oh my gosh, no, it's still going to all be online.
I mean, time has it's so elastic this year, isn't it? And when you look back at what you were doing, say, sort of 14, 15 months ago, it does seem like an entirely different world.
Yeah, wow, gosh, what a huge thing. And Sophie, I mean, it must have been quite a different year for you as well. I was talking to Claire a bit about the rise of people wanting to listen to things rather than just read, how we've kind of all got quite tired of screens during the lockdown and during this last year where everything's moved online. I wonder, is your work, because you've done a lot of audiobooks, so you are the reader for Zed and the Cormorants on the audiobook. Have you found that you've had a lot more audiobook work coming out this year?
There's been a fair bit of it, and I'm very glad that right near the beginning of lockdown I thought to myself, shall I buy a microphone? Shall I spend that money? Will I ever get that money back? Because it was like, we didn't know, did we? It may have lasted 2 weeks, and I'm so glad I did. And then I was looking for somewhere around the house where would be good for recording, and somebody had once told me that my airing cupboard had a very good ambience. So I went in there and I kind of did a couple of tests with my microphone. It's tiny with these towels piled up and sheets and everything. And then I put some, we used to get deliveries from a food delivery company, and they put this sort of wool layer on top. So I put that all behind me as well. And I've made this little studio, which my son very cleverly called the on-airing cupboard. And it's stood me in great stead. Yeah, so occasionally I can be found, in my cupboard recording a book. And everybody has to keep very quiet and can't go up the stairs, no toilet flushing, all that.
That's amazing. Do you know, I've just been reading a book by Glennon Doyle where she actually talks about climbing into her cupboard in order to be able to hear her thoughts. And so I actually really like this idea of escaping into your cupboard away from it all, where you actually can't hear anything else from the outside world.
I had a cupboard under the stairs when I was, I lived in a flat in London many years ago, and I was sharing it with a boyfriend, and he paid sort of 1.5 times the rent that I did so that he could have the spare bedroom as his study. And when we moved in, I opened this cupboard under the stairs, and I thought, I can make a study in here. And I put a little shelf in, and I had a little stool, and it was wonderful because it was completely quiet. And when people came to sort of bang on the
Mm,
door or make deliveries or anything else, they would never know that I was there. So actually, I was
mm.
interrupted far less, and I quite miss my cupboard.
Maybe we all need a little cupboard for our creativity to hibernate in. We can
I don't think
disappear
it's
into
what
that
Virginia
space.
Woolf meant when she said a room for one's own. I think she imagined something a little bit more spacious, but there you go.
But a room in itself is something.
Yeah,
So I'm
indeed.
really interested in the fact that you both are actors, and I wonder, Claire, how was it for you when you first heard that your book was going to come to life through an audio book? Did that kind of mean something to you, the idea of the characters coming to life in that voiced way?
Yeah, I mean, it was lovely to think that somebody else would voice it. Yeah, I mean, years ago, I did some audiobook narration, which was for a series of Barbara Cartland novels. Actually, I fell off. I was in a show in the West End, and I fell off the stage and damaged my back, so I couldn't go to work. And someone involved in the company, or someone in the company, was involved in this project. So I went to this recording studio in Soho every day, where they were obviously used to having really cool bands, and I'd sort of rock up and start reading these Barbara Cartlands, and they would sit behind the screen just falling about with laughter because they'd never heard anything like it. So it was hard. There was an awful lot of stopping and starting to sort of get rid of the giggles. But other than that,
Mm,
I've never done any audiobooks. And I know from friends that do it, it is a very specific skill. And just because you act, it doesn't mean you can do audiobooks. It's very, very different. So I'm very appreciative that someone who is an expert took on Z for me.
mm.
Oh.
Was it something new for you, Sophie, to kind of adapt to audiobooks from, because obviously initially you were acting on screen and TV presenting, and so that switch to audiobooks, was that something quite big for you?
I've always read out loud. I used to read out loud to my brother and do all the voices. And in fact, he would beg me to stop sometimes because I'd just go on and on. Um, and then I don't know, I started doing voiceovers. And I guess when I was presenting things like words and pictures, we did do stories. I did Jack and Nori. So it wasn't sort of, it was, and I would use auto cue as well. So it wasn't that much of a stretch to then turn it into audiobooks. And then when I had my first son, who's now 21, I sort of gradually tailed off doing the telly and did more and more books and voiceover
Right.
work. And I've done the odd telly and theatre stuff, but yeah, I don't know. I think it was a sort of a felt like a very natural progression. I do think audiobooks are the most challenging work that an actor can do, I think, in many ways.
Mm.
I mean, that's probably putting people, doing Shakespeare down, but you are performing on your own if you're, for 6-7 hours a day, and you're doing all the voices, you're doing all the parts, you're having to remember what voice is which. It's a real challenge to do.
That for
Um,
me would be the switching between the different voices. I think would be the real
Mm.
challenge. I mean, I was never brilliant at accents, but if I fully immersed myself in an accent, I'd have to work at it. It wasn't I wasn't brilliant at it. I'd have to really, really work at it. But the idea of sort of doing Liverpudlian in 1 minute and Cornish the next would be a disaster, I think, for me.
Mm.
the most difficult I've ever done was doing Sylvester McCoy in a Doctor Who book, who played my Doctor, who's got this Scottish accent, but he's very hard to do. In fact, John Culshaw, who's a friend of mine and of Sylvester's, even he can't do him, and he does brilliant voices. He's in Dead
Oh,
Ringers, for goodness
wow.
sake. He can't do Sylvester. And I'm always picked to do Sylvester's voice. And I had to do Sylvester's voice, and then the other main character was Irish. And So I was swapping between
Goodness,
Scottish
yeah.
and Irish. And I had to, there were several occasions where I had to go before the Irish, I'd just have to go, poor editor, coppity, 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 coppity. And then I'd do the line, and then I'd go Scottish, Scottish before the Sylvester's line. And the poor editor had to cut out this cuppity, cuppity and this Scottish.
The tricks that you have to come up with. I mean, it's really interesting. It strikes me, two things strike me from that. One being how hard it must be to actually perform without an audience present. Like you say, you're performing for hours in a day and you've not even got that audience to ride off of. And I mean, that strikes me also as being fairly similar in writing. There's this strange thing where you're writing and you're not getting the feedback for months and months actually, and yet you're still having to really absorb yourself into that person and those people, those places, and believe that you're doing well enough. And yeah, it's a difficult thing, I imagine. And also I'm wondering, Sophie, do you find that have are you a big reader? Does that reading and that interest in diving into people's worlds for a longer period of time, does that help you in wanting to embody these characters in the voice and the audio?
It was a real joy to read this one. I just loved it, and all the characters are so beautifully real, really fleshed out so well. And really, that as an audiobook reader, that's what you long for, just the characters that hop off the page. And I mean, I could see every sentence, because as I'm reading, it's like reading a book anyway, but I'm imagining it in my head. So yeah, it was great. It was a gift to
That
read.
really fascinates me because I know, Claire, you said to me about how your acting skills kind of come in to your writing in character, and actually character is the most important part to you, that you start off by acting the character and embodying the character, and then you bring that onto the page. So I imagine that really carried through into, yeah, the character then leaping off the page for Sophie. Can you tell me a bit more about that process for you, Claire?
Yeah, I think it's fairly instinctive, but I think if you have spent, certainly the early part of your career, which I did, starting with somebody else's words and breathing life into them, um, I think when I sit down to write, I first of all, I think I often just intuitively have a kind of 5-act structure in terms of I've written a couple of other novels which still need some work, but there is definitely this kind of obvious structure, which, when you read books like, what's the Sean Coyne one, the story grid, and they always go on about this. But I think if you have worked on a lot of plays, that comes to you quite naturally. And I do plan a little bit in terms of I know where I need to end up, but the bit that I really, really focus on in the early stages of writing is really, really getting to know my characters, because then they can kind of lead you, and they'll lead you in different ways, and that's kind of where the magic happens. You're still got this kind of end place in mind, but they will often take you off to places that you didn't necessarily anticipate if they are well enough developed before you actually begin. So I definitely use techniques that probably come from a rehearsal room. I will find the right shoes. It's interesting. I went up to London a couple of weeks ago to walk around a bit of the novel I'm writing now is all set in North Kensington and around Grenfell Tower and Portobello and all those kind of areas. And I made sure that I had the right shoes, as I might well have done in a rehearsal space if I was devising a character or sort of finding my own way into a well-known character. Because I think it was really important that when I walked around and experienced those places in London, I kind of did it in character almost. And I often kind of really think about the physical things. I think about the contents of a handbag. I think handbags are fascinating because they're always documents, especially if yours is like mine, which is just filled with, food wrappers and receipts, and you can tell so much and what someone's reading and what trains they've been on and what they had for breakfast. So I quite often think in terms of sort of handbags, or I'll go shopping and I've been writing in the morning and then I have to pop into Tesco's or something, I will often think about what my character would buy, maybe for just some of that sort of walking around the aisles of the supermarket. So I do definitely embody it. And I also, it was interesting, Sophie saying about reading aloud. I read everything aloud. And when I write scenes which involve a lot of dialogue, I usually write them first and foremost like a play script. So there'll be no he said, she said, there'll be no description. It will literally I will allow the characters to speak for themselves. The whole conversation will happen, and then I'll go back in a second draft and kind of fill in all the other stuff. So it's very, very character led, and I'm sure that does come from a background of sort of theatre.
That's so interesting. I mean, I just love the thought that actually it's so important to you, it literally coming to life, that parts of the way of the process are you bringing it to life and then returning it to the page. And that's something that also I'm curious about with you, Sophie. I know you've actually written a book yourself, and so you've got this character that you're extremely famous for having played now, Ace, in Doctor Who, and you have ended up writing a book continuing that story. Is that something that, being part of that character for so long, was there still that urge to take it further, take it somewhere else, put her in a different form?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a writer like Claire's a writer. First and foremost, I collaborated on the book with two other writers who are very experienced. But I definitely, like, the character of Ace is. Somebody once asked me at a convention, how much of you is Ace and how much of Ace is you? And it's like, gosh, what would I have been like now if I hadn't played that character for, well, most of my life now, you know?
Yes.
Because obviously she continues on in audio form with plays with there's a company called Big Finish who publish CDs. There's all sorts of ways that Ace has lived on after the TV series. And I'm constantly going to conventions and things. So it's a very interesting question. So when it came to writing the character of Ace, I knew exactly who she'd be right now, because it's like writing the up-to-date version, because I've lived her in a way, and also hearing fans and what they imagine she would be doing now. And so yes, it's not it's kind of cheating in a way, because it's all there. It's kind of it's already
Oh,
there.
it's fascinating.
Mm.
I mean, it's interesting. I wonder if you found any of Ace and Zed, because when I was reading it, I actually felt like, there are parallels here, and I thought maybe it's quite appropriate that Sophie was the one gifted to read this. I don't know if you saw that, Claire. Did you feel like?
No, that never occurred to me. But I have to admit that I'm not a massive sort of Doctor Who. I certainly saw the kind of series that was on when we were children, because everybody watched Doctor Who. There was no alternative on at that time.
Yeah.
So I'm much more familiar with those kind of early ones than I am with the more recent. So I do remember Ace, but I don't think I knew her well enough to think, Sophie is the perfect. I was just told that Sophie was doing it by my publisher, and I said, great,
That's amazing.
I wonder if, because Cherry, who is the publisher,
Yeah.
we met a few years ago doing a community opera together, and she knows the character of Ace. So I wonder whether that was in the back of her mind as well. But I think Zed and Amy together probably are, because
Yes.
Zed hasn't got that kind of bolshy side that Ace has, but Amy has,
Yeah, so that she somewhere sits in between the two.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I can really see that being the kind of mix, and I do wonder if that was in Cherry's mind. And Claire, how much do you see yourself in the characters in Amy or in Zed?
Not that much, really. I mean, in terms of circumstance, I mean, obviously I moved, well, it's not obvious, but I did move to Cornwall 15 years ago, but I was an adult and it was very much my choice. Whereas for Zed in the book, she's 14 and she has this whole fresh start kind of thrust upon her. against her will, really, but she goes along with it because she understands how important it is for her mum's mental health mainly, and also to get her kind of Hella of a sister Amy back on the rails. So she's definitely at the start of the book putting everybody else's needs before her own, and not very good at voicing her own needs, and what she the support she needs from her family she certainly doesn't get. And I think everybody remembers that sense of not having your needs fully met as a teenager at some point, or certainly a lot of people do. And I did change schools when I was a similar age to Zed, and different cities as well. And I moved from living with my mum to living with my father and my stepmother. So it was quite a big wrench. So I suppose some of that feeds into it. But I didn't have the issues around anxiety and the panic attacks and all those sort of things that Zed has. I think I just kind of knuckled down and got on with it. Not that's not to say it wasn't difficult, but I was very good at putting on a front and just going out and being big and bold and brave in a way that she isn't at the start of the book. So I'm very different to her from that point of view. And Amy, no, I would have quite liked to have been that bolshy teenager, but I was just a bit of a sort of swatty girl, really. I sort of secretly admire people like that. And actually, Amy's got lots of really good points, even though she's pretty stroppy at the start. She definitely kind of comes into her own, and the relationship between the sisters, I was really keen that would really develop during the course of the book. And also that although the book is very focused on Zed and how she copes with this situation, it was really important that Amy was also three-dimensional, and she's also on a journey, and that was fully explored as well. But I think I probably would have always secretly wanted to be friends with Amy, but probably wasn't quite cool enough, maybe.
That's the great opportunity about writing, though, isn't it? You can write out characters that you might be fascinated in, or you'd like to spend a bit of time with. You can actually spend time with them on the page, and yeah, I really love that relationship between the sisters. I have a sister myself, and it felt very familiar. It's a very special and interesting, complex bond, and I thought you captured that really well. And I'm glad you raised the kind of mental health issues that come into the book, because you were saying to me actually, I thought it was really interesting, this idea that audiobooks and podcasts and things that audio stories, things that grew quite large during the lockdowns of the last year, were potentially helping aid a loneliness that was also growing and spreading, because you literally have someone's voice in your ear keeping you company as you're walking, as you're doing your dishes, as you're at home on your own. And I wonder, for you, was this quite an important issue that you wanted to bring into the book, or what kind of brought you to having panic attacks and anxiety?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's hard to write anything these days, that if you're writing about people truly and honestly, there's always going to be some aspect of their mental health that you have to consider. So I don't think I would ever write something without not really engaging in that, particularly if you're writing for young people. Um, when I started, the kind of vague idea in my head was when I moved. The book is all set on a sort of fictionalized version of the Foy estuary, which is where I live. So I know the woods very well, and I know this area very well. And I had this. I'm very comfortable here. I love it. We chose to buy a house here, but I remember walking in the woods when we'd only been here for probably a couple of months, and thinking, gosh, if you had come from the city and you weren't used to having this amount of really kind of wild nature on your doorstep, for me, it's a wonderful kind of place to kind of clear your head and engage in the natural world and all those kind of things. But actually, if you're already battling loneliness, anxiety, then it would be totally overwhelming. And that was the sort of starting point, trying to put someone in this environment who was struggling already, and seeing how they would respond to it. So I suppose the starting point was a kind of young woman who's struggling, and that felt important to write. I'm not entirely sure why, other than I've worked and come across a lot of young people. I worked as an education enabler. I've done lots of theatre projects. I've got my own teenage children, and I do think it's a really tough time to grow up. And I think a lot of I think social media adds a whole new pressure to young people that we didn't have to deal with when we were younger. And I suppose my children weren't teenagers quite at that point, but I suppose I was kind of exploring and prepping a little bit subconsciously for that as well.
Yes, yeah, that must play a big part in it all. And I mean, you've mentioned the kind of emphasis on nature in the book, and that, I mean, it's interesting. It's almost like that was the birthplace as well for the book, was spending time in that particular area, seeing that around you, and it is quite a natural link, actually. I mean, like you say, can you avoid mental health? Can anybody avoid that being a part of who they are? And so it's so integral as a character, really, to approach that aspect too of a personality, and the part nature plays. That's also something that's being discussed a lot: nature and mental health, and the benefit
Well,
that that
particularly
can
after
have.
lockdown. I mean, in some ways, this actually delaying a year, it suddenly made some of the topics around this. But I mean, everyone joking about, but everyone making their own sourdough bread, and this family are artisan
Yes,
bakers. So all the sort of discussion about that kind of stuff became very relevant.
it's true.
Yeah, and I think the nature thing. I mean, for me, I can't see a better. You've kind of got the space when people are out in the natural world to really explore the link as well between kind of personal trauma in people's lives and environmental trauma, and actually talking about kind of characters slightly taking over. I didn't set out with necessarily a particularly environmental message in mind, but Tamsin, because she's this quite sort of feisty kind of beach cleaner and everything else, that came through very
Mm,
strongly. And I think as I was writing it, I was exploring that idea that the natural world is very much a barometer often, or the way you respond to the natural world is a barometer for your own mental health sometimes, and your own levels of
mm,
anxiety, how much you're able to be kind of really present and enjoy it, or how much you've got so much going on that you can't connect to it. And certainly the anxiety that Zed fears, which is sort of manifested in these birds, is very much an anxiety that actually comes from other parts of her life. And by writing a book that was, on the one hand, quite a kind of gritty family drama, but on the other hand, had a kind of foot in the camp of myth and mythology and magic, and all the stuff around these birds that came from kind of mythology from all around the world. I was
yeah,
able to explore fear and anxiety on two different levels and negotiate that kind of hinterland between fear and anxiety via a gothic lens, or through a gothic lens, and the very relatable anxieties that teenagers have. And by kind of playing out the two stories in parallel, you can see that the way that Zed learns to kind of problem solve, face her fear, and kind of work with it, but still act, and the self confidence and the empowering kind of, um, well, certainly how that empowers her. They're all sort of strategies and skills that she can bring to her new circumstances, to sort of making
yes.
friends and starting a new school, and being honest with her parents about who she is and what she needs and all of those things. So it gave me a kind of broader canvas, if you like, in which to
Yes.
explore anxiety.
Yeah, I can really see that now when you're talking about it. It's very beautifully done in the book. It's actually quite subtle. I mean, it's not subtle. The themes are very clear, but that purposefulness doesn't come across. What comes across just is this multifaceted layer of the themes. And I think you're right. That depth really comes from there being place in nature to explore that, and in place and in scene, as well as through the characters. And there are so many different characters with different lives and complexities going on in those lives, all interplaying with one another. So, Sophie, how about you? How is nature playing a part in your life? Because are you living in London? Is that right? You've had quite a different year
We
to
moved
us.
out of London.
Ah,
We went from Ladywell, which is Lewisham, southeast London, to Hertfordshire, leafy Hertfordshire.
Oh, wow.
I mean, when I tell you that our road is called Featherbed Lane, it kind of paints a picture. Yeah, so we've gone from a view of, you know, the rooftops of Lewisham to fields and trees. So yeah, nature plays a huge part in my life, and
Right.
and also I was sort of half brought up in Norfolk as well, and so I'm very beaches are a big thing. I remember the oil spills of the 70s, you know, and
Yeah.
the birds, the oily birds then, and even now, you know, I walk up and down the lanes with a plastic bag every now and again, and
So we do
put
that
all
as
this
well.
sort of
Oh.
McDonald's packaging and the crisp packets and things in my bag. There's a lovely elderly couple who live around here. They do that as well. So yeah, I would say yeah, the environment is hugely. My eldest son actually, he's at university studying energy engineering and
Oh,
sustainability.
wow.
So yeah, it's kind of a big part of our lives.
Mm.
So yeah, this was another appeal about the book. I thought, and I thought with Tamsin and her gang, it was so right that because that is the kind of thing that young people, in a way, are much more immersed in that world than people of our age, and you know, sort of because it's their future, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
They're the ones who've got to do something about it.
Which is why it's really interesting also to explore this idea that actually if you have kind of self-respect and sort of self-love, or if you're kind to yourself, that is automatically linked into, or has to be kind of totally involved in caring for your environment as well. And
Mm.
that's you know, something that I explored a lot in the book. Um, and making peace with the natural world and finding a way to live in harmony with it is very much tied in with making peace with yourself and your circumstances. And you really see that
Mm.
play out in Cornwall, I think, more than you would certainly in a city where people may still have very strong opinions, which is great, and be, you know, really keen on kind of the environmental message. You kind of see it in people's everyday lives down here and the choices they
Yes.
make. And as you say, like picking up litter. And my son went out with a friend of his on a kayak on the river the other day, and they were gone for hours. And I was beginning to get really quite twitchy. And you start having that conversation with yourself, going, "Well, they can swim and they're sensible." And they were gone for hours, but the reason was they'd kind of pulled the kayak over to the side of the river and found all this litter, and then spent the next sort of 2 hours packing up the boat with all these bits of plastic and
Oh,
bottles and
wow.
empty cans that they brought home. And
Wow.
Wow.
you know, he got some extra time on Minecraft that night.
Deserved it after all that. Did you find that for you when you moved down to Cornwall that changed for you as well then, that you started kind of feeling more connected to that? And because Cornwall does seem to play quite a part in this book, like you say, the place is very much based on that Foy estuary, and the place names feel very familiar, and the nature, the descriptions, is that quite important?
Yeah, I mean the names are all very closely. I mean, so that Tremelin, that the little hamlet I live in is called Milltown, and Tre means sort of homestead in Cornish, and Melin is mill, and so they are very closely linked. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it was kind of a love letter to where I live as well, and because there is something really magical about this little hamlet. And in fact, I discovered when we looked around the house that Joan Aiken, the children's writer, lived here in the 1950s, and she also wrote a couple of books. One kind of quite early, quite patchy, but very funny thriller, which is called The Ribs of Death, which ends up with this amazing chase along a viaduct with some kind of leopard, this wild leopard. But in later books, there are little things like there's a postbox in the wall, which we've got at the end of the garden. And when I kind of realised this connection, I got in contact with her daughter who runs the Joan Aiken estate, and she shared lots of letters and bits of diaries. And it was really interesting seeing the parallels of someone that moved here with a young family in the 1950s and was kind of working the land a bit and had chickens and was growing her own vegetables, and also doing B&B. And I do Airbnb to make the time and to be able to afford to take a little bit of time off to write. So
Yes.
it was very interesting seeing that, 70 years apart, we were kind of doing exactly the same thing, but equally had been really inspired by the place where we live. So it's not just giving us the space to write, but it's also really influencing what
That's
we
so
both
interesting
wrote.
that
Yeah.
parallels can kind of be picked
Um,
up all that time apart. I
yeah.
think nature sometimes can have that influence in terms of it is timeless in itself, isn't it? It's quite different to society and civilization where yeah, the ideas can maybe change, but in some ways the natural world can still move us. And I mean, I can read pieces of literature from a long, long time ago. And if it's based in nature, I mean, you still relate to a very human element of literature too, no matter how old it is. But there is something in that. But then it's interesting that you, Sophie, raised the fact that I think it was you that people, maybe the more current generations, are responding quite differently. And Claire, I wonder, does having children, has that influenced your work, like you wanting to write a YA book and you being aware that these issues might be a little bit more important or prevalent to that age?
I think I certainly, having, as I said, worked either kind of via education or theatre projects or things, I think the characters that I met along the way, although none of the characters that I've written are based on anyone in particular, they're all certainly lots of these young people I've met along the way, and have kind of really inspired Zed and Tamsin, and Denzel as well. Um, yeah, so that's true. Um, I'm just thinking about what you just said about nature and the sort of universality of it as well, and the fact that it doesn't change. Because I suppose the other thing that really inspired me when I was thinking about how to sort of structure this book and how to find a way into it was cormorants. And obviously it's called Zed and the Cormorants. And I was out walking when I had this idea about this girl and struggling with anxiety, and I saw these two birds with their wings outstretched in that very kind of iconic way they have, where they look like coat hangers. And I remember thinking, gosh, I'm looking at them as a kind of fairly comfortable adult,
Mm.
thinking, aren't they poised? Aren't they graceful? But how would they seem to someone that was coming to it from a place of fear? And you suddenly realize how sinister, with
Yes.
that kind of filter, how sinister they are. And I went off and started researching them, and I was amazed at how much they have obviously inspired people in
Oh,
literature
wow.
from kind of the year dot. I mean, they're mentioned in the Odyssey. They're mentioned, I think, 4 times in the Bible. Shakespeare mentions them, but they're always Milton as well. But they're always getting quite a bad press. In the Bible, they're unclean. In Milton, Satan disguises himself as a cormorant, devising death to them that lived. So there was part of me thinking, well, gosh, these birds are really inspiring people, and have done for years. But I want to slightly redress
Mm.
the balance and kind of look at the other side, because they're amazing. I mean, they're so adaptable. The fact that they're kind of on every continent in the world, and they've been around since the dinosaurs, and even in their sort of environments where they are, 1 minute they're a bird, and then they're diving. I think in some parts of the world they can dive 45 meters down to get fish. So they are kind of swimming better than the fish, to get their supper. And I thought there's a lot that this character Zed can learn from that. This idea about how you adapt, how you survive. So part of it was also kind of paying homage, or kind of recognizing all the stuff in literature and mythology as well. And
Yeah.
Denzel is a character who really can kind of wax lyrical about the
Yes.
Norwegian myths and the Polynesian myths, and the Chinese and the Japanese and everything else. But it was also about recognizing that we need to find a bit of balance here. The cormorants should get some good press ultimately, even if at the start of the book they are kind of something to be afraid of.
I love this idea that, yeah, you could kind of dig deeper and deeper into this creature from this one experience of yourself looking at it with those fresh eyes. And then suddenly, hang on a second, there's this whole wealth behind it.
Well, the other thing that was really interesting, because obviously I was looking at these birds on this particular river. When I started researching cormorants in Cornwall, I discovered that in 1910 or 1911, I think it was, County Hall offered a shilling for every cormorant head, because they thought they were interfering with the fisherman's catch. And it was only in 1929 when someone actually cut open a cormorant and analysed the stomachs did they realise there was nothing in there that was marketable. But at that stage, 10,000 birds had been decapitated. So in terms of my sort of narrative and my story, that gave me a real incentive for these birds to potentially seek revenge on the sort of human community that was kind of living alongside them. So it very definitely then had to root that story in Cornwall.
I'm getting the real impression that you're a kind of story hunter, that seeing things and getting inspired by them and kind of drawing narratives and wanting to take it further and understand it more. That this kind of writerly way seems quite inherent in how you look and respond to the world. I wonder, when you were acting, were you already writing when you were living in London and acting, or was writing something that's kind of you've discovered later?
I definitely wrote a lot as a child, and certainly when I was acting, I used to write quite a lot of audition monologues for myself because I couldn't find what I was looking for. So I played around, and I kind of, when you devise a show and then you write it down, you've sort of half written it, but so is everyone else in the cast. So there was lots of kind of collaborative projects. I mean, the first novel that I wrote, which is, luckily in a drawer somewhere, or a metaphorical drawer, it's on a memory stick, and it will probably never see the light of day, was probably in my late 20s. And then I wrote another kind of middle grade novel that a slightly kind of, unfortunately, this kind of central idea, unless I completely rework that, has become a little bit outdated now, because of the kind of development of sort of VR headsets and things. But it was all to do with uploading memories onto a computer for this girl who had been bereaved and had no memories of her father, and had these 5 photographs. But actually, that's not such a ridiculous idea anymore, with sort of Second Life and all those things. So that one has kind of got parked as well. So I had two kind of novels under my belt before writing this. So I think I have been writing for a while, but it's always fitting it in around life and work and family and, all those kind of things. But I do get very lost down the rabbit warren of research, because I get really fascinated. I'm doing it at the moment for something I'm writing now. Every day I sort of sit down to write, and I think, I'll just check this. And, 2.5 hours later, I kind of think, that was my writing morning gone. And I know a lot more about, whatever it is, but I've written nothing. So yeah, it's a challenge to know when you say, right, enough, at least finish a draft. You can always come back and fill in the gaps
I
later.
love this thing of trying to balance your creative life with your normal life, and then just the being able to move between art forms really fascinates me. I find a lot of people I speak to on this podcast, but artists I just speak to in general, have actually kind of had several art forms interplaying throughout their careers, and dipped in and out and found certain things that work for them more. And then, I don't know, Sophie, you've had such a varied career. Do you quite like to keep that variation, or is that something? Yeah, what kind of keeps you going and dipping and changing?
Yeah, I think producers found it quite difficult to pin me down and say, "Oh, is she an actress? Oh, hang on a minute, she's playing the lead part in a West End musical. Oh, she's presenting a children's program. Oh no, she's not. She's doing this religious program now up in Manchester. So I think that's the key, really, is like variety is the spice of life, isn't it? And I love music as well. I've always sung, so bringing that in as well, children's theatre, just like done teaching. So I think it's very, I think if you're creative, I can see it in my younger son, who is exploding with creativity. He's 18, and he's very talented musicals guy. He dances, which I never did, and
Wow.
sings and acts, but also he's always making clothes, or drawing something amazing. Or he took a friend down to the canal today in a sort of Elizabethan dress to take photos of her for a
Oh,
project that
wow.
he's doing, and I think that's the thing. I think creativity, we try and box it, don't we? We say,
Yes,
well, are you an actress, or are you a writer, or are you a this, or are you a that? But creativity is creativity.
absolutely.
And they all feed off each other, don't they? The more, and it's interesting actually when I write, certainly in the very early stages, I quite often, I mean, I'm not an artist at all, but I will draw
Mm,
things, not people, because I get into my people, in the way that we've already discussed. But if it was a place, or, I'm writing something at the moment that involves butterflies, and actually I got my daughter's watercolors, and I wouldn't share them, but by drawing them or painting them, you really see them. It makes you see them, and then I can write about it in
mm,
words. But I often use different forms to kind of find my way into finding the words
yes.
to describe it, and that thing about really seeing something. Sometimes you need to try and recreate it in a different way. Certainly early on in writing projects for me, and then it helps me kind of clarify what I'm drawn to, and what does really interest me, and what actually after a little while you realize is not the route you need to go, because I can't get excited about trying to sort of engage with it via any other
Yeah,
creative
I
form.
think that's so true. It's interesting because I definitely was a bit like your son, Sophie. When I was growing up, I was interested in so many different art forms, and I didn't really question it because they each kind of worked for a different part of me. And actually, I think you're right, Claire, in terms of they were each feeding into one another, helping the other one improve. So by looking at the world through the lens of a camera, I gained quite a different perspective that allowed me to write a scene a bit more uniquely, let's say, rather than just seeing it in the same way. And yet,
Mm.
it's so fed to us, well, what are you going to be? Which I got very frustrated at that when it came to choosing university. Which university are you going to go for which art form? Which one do you pick? And I had such a determination. I could keep them all up, but of course life goes on, and it's hard to keep every art playing. I'm wondering about your kind of average creative day. So yeah, I mean, starting with you, Claire, if you are managing to slip some creativity into your day, what does that look like? How does that fit in, and how does that go?
The only way I can guarantee it, and certainly when my kids were younger, is getting up at 5 in the morning, because I would just wake up. There's never a dishwasher to empty. Well, there might be, but I'm not going to pay any attention to it. There's no emails, there's no phone calls, there's no mum, where's my gym kit. I would have, 2.5, yeah, 2.5, nearly 3 hours probably when they were young to just write. And if I could get a good chunk done then you're kind of in the zone. So then you can go off and do other things and come back. If I don't get something done in the morning, then I often by kind of midday, 1 o'clock, I have kind of given up on that as a writing day. So what I will do is cram in all the chores, tax returns, cabin changeovers to the Airbnb, everything that I can that afternoon to clear the decks then for the following day. So no day is ever the same. But I don't have a kind of, I must write 1,000 words today, because, there are days when I go off and do kind of role play jobs, and I might be leaving at 6:30 in the morning, and I won't be back till 7, 8 at night. So there's no way that I'm going to fit in 1,000 words then, and I'm not going to beat myself up over it. So every day is different, really. I sort of fantasize about the idea that one day you'd sort of go off on one of these amazing retreats, and that's all I would do. But I suspect, I don't know, I think if I put myself in that situation where suddenly all I could do is write, after a few days I'd certainly want to go out exploring and
Mm.
walking. I mean, I don't know how people go off to places like Crete to write, because you think, well, if I'm in Crete, there's so much to explore. Why would I sit in my room? It's funny, I was listening to a podcast with Grace Dent recently, and she said when she knows she's got to get a certain number of words done, she goes and books into a Premier Inn, because she
Oh
knows
yes.
she won't be distracted by any sort of interesting restaurants or anything. There is literally nothing to do other than get her laptop out and bang out the words. And I thought, I think that's quite extreme. I might find that a little bit depressing, but I do relate
That's
to some of
such a
that.
good point. Yes. I mean, I've quite often gone off for a month house sitting in a different country to isolate myself and be able to do that writing. But there is something quite strange about going somewhere and not exploring. And if you've got that kind of urge and thirst normally, then yeah, it's hang on a second, how can I just sit inside and write all this time?
So I think you have to do it first. You have to do it at 5. It's done by 10, and then you can go out on a sort of 20-mile stomp in the afternoon.
Does that work with you too, Sophie? What's your kind of average creative day look like?
Oh, goodness. As Claire was saying, there's never an average day. It'll always be something different. And I suppose I'm so used to that because that's how my whole career's gone. I could be doing one thing one day and one the next. But I think, I don't know, my creativity is slightly different to yours because yours writing is, as I found out, is a more sort of solitary affair. And I love communication. I love being with people and I love. So, I'm chair of a charity of a Steiner school, and so that's creative at the moment. Working out what we've got to do there, and then I do a lot of. I'm training to be a seminar leader in a personal development company, and so that takes up a lot of my time as well. And then I'll be maybe prepping a book for a bit, or even going in the garden, doing a bit of gardening. I mean, that's creative too, isn't it?
Yes.
It's really, and I sports as well. I do running, or I've discovered this dance form called Nia. I never danced when I was younger, and I found that I love dancing. I absolutely love it. So I do a class 3 times a week, and then in lockdown I started playing the piano again. I used to hate playing the piano when I was younger, and I thought, maybe I should give it a go. And I started, and I do 10 minutes minimum a day. I've been doing that since last November, I think. And I always end up doing sort of, half an hour or more. So that's been great for no reason. But I think everybody is creative. It's just it's just different forms of creativity, isn't it? Creativity can be, you can be creative doing the housework, I think, in many ways.
I love that. That's really nice. When you're talking, I'm really picturing, actually, hang on a second, I could just move through every moment of my life and view it each as a different creative task. And I felt very peaceful when you were saying that. I was thinking, oh, okay, that's nice. I can connect to that. That can be a positive way
I think it's a sort of, it's more of a way of being, isn't it? If you create it that way for yourself, that rather than what you have to do, which we're all driven to do as human beings. It's weird because we're called human beings, aren't we? But we all end up doing. But the being part of being a human being is, I think creativity is a part of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting
definitely
point. And I'm fascinated then with because I find, well, I've often talked to people, to friends, about how I would like to be able to live in a way where those tasks are more your being than doing, like you say. So I think things like doing the garden, even when you're doing a full-time job, it's this task suddenly that you're trying to do in between things rather than something that's part of your everyday being. But the thing that most for me takes me out of the being is technology. So I find it really, really difficult to maintain that creative attitude when I'm working with technology. And I'm really aware that both of you have kind of had to take on technology into your art form. So Claire, you were talking to me about starting to use the program Scrivener for your writing.
Yeah. I'm probably only using it at about 3% of what it actually is capable of, because it is. I've done the first tutorial about 4 times, and my brain just doesn't work that way. But my handwriting is so dire that actually when I do, I mean, if I hit a block, or sometimes when I'm thinking about a particular scene, I will write long form. But then when I come back to it, I spend 20 minutes trying to decipher, what I was writing. And I think I edit a lot as I go along, and so I'm constantly crossing out, rewriting, crossing out as I'm writing it, so it just becomes such a mess that I did learn to touch type years ago, actually. I remember my dad saying when I finished my A levels, he said it will be useful, And of course, every part of me bristled, thinking I will never need to touch type. But actually, he was right. So I can type quite fast, and obviously I can edit at the same time. So I have written my last 2 novels just on Microsoft Word, but I do get to the stage where I have to print them all out, and I'm literally on my hands and knees with a kind of Pritt stick and glue trying to move scenes around. And I thought, this is ridiculous. If I can just get my head around some software where I can kind of do it on a corkboard or have,
Yeah.
character lines, particularly since what I'm writing at the moment has a sort of dual narrative. I still live in utter fear that I will accidentally wipe the entire thing. So I'm constantly sort of backing it up into, even though it's on a cloud, I also have it in Word documents and things because it doesn't come naturally to me. But I agree that there is something about it that kind of shuts off or can very easily shut off the creative part of your brain. So I think that's when things like the sketching or the drawing or the mind maps or all those kind of things, I have to keep feeding them in. And also I can't sit and write for hours. So I will sit at the laptop, and then that's where the gardening comes in. I will then run outside and do something really
Right.
physical for 40 minutes, whether it's just moving earth or, digging a trench or whatever. And then I'll come back in and do some more writing, because I find my energy levels, if I stare at a screen for too long, and I'm sure you must get that, Sophie, when you're recording. I mean, I crash and burn very quickly if I don't keep getting up and moving around.
Yes, it's very easy to get stuck, isn't it, once you're in front of a screen? But I don't know. I think it's different with reading a book, though, because that's a creative process. Because I'm, as I was saying before, I'm seeing the scenes, so it's almost like being in a show or a film, because I'm putting myself in the book. So,
and it's that engagement that probably keeps you totally focused.
Yes.
Whereas I think for me, certainly if I write a scene, I mean, everything that I ever write, I read aloud. I have to read it aloud to hear it. I can't read it on a screen. So whenever I've written, and I'm very aware of trees and paper and everything else, but I just can't see if something's working on a screen. I have to print it out, and I have to hold the paper in my hand, and I have to read it aloud. And then I know instantly why it's not working. Well, I don't always, but that's the aim. I often know very quickly why something's not working, what needs work on. But while it's in front of me on a screen, it's like some kind of film just comes, like some 2 cataracts. They just kind of come across, and I just can't. Everything's woolly. I just can't. So I can get it out there, but in order to then engage with it further, I need to print it out. And read it out.
Oh, I'm definitely the same.
But do you write your poem? Do you write everything long form then, Polly? Do you write everything in books?
Pretty much everything I've written is so. My first novel that I wrote, the entire thing was written longhand, and then I had to painstakingly type it all up. But I actually find it really helpful because the typing up, it's the chance to edit. So I get that first edit done in it's a little bit what you're saying about the engagement. It's a slightly more interactive edit for me than just reading through. And I get much more troubled when it then comes to the edits where it's all on a computer, and that's where I do what you do, Claire, and I print it all off and cut bits up and draw lines over it. And I'm sure it must take a much longer time to do it that way, but it's the only way that I can find. And also what you were saying about being in a different country and wanting to explore, it's really important to me to get to be outside as much as possible. And the writing process takes so long that whatever way I can to be able to do that work outside is really important to me.
You go and write outside in the garden or wherever?
Yes,
or in the woods?
So I will write. Most of the work originates when I'm out on walks or out sitting somewhere outside. And then the editing, I mean, I'm well known to trying to drag a computer outside. And again, the touch typing, that's where it comes in handy because I can't see the screen, but at least I can keep touch typing. And everyone's going, "Oh, Polly, I think you need to come inside. It's much more sensible." And no, I can't do that.
I had this sort of fantasy of a writing room in somewhere in my garden where one side of it is entirely glass. So I am inside and I do have things plugged in and all the rest of it, but I can feel it's a sort of indoor outdoor space. I could cheat and pretend I'm outside, but I can still, as you say, see the screen and and stay dry.
That's the Virginia Woolf's dream room of one's own.
That really is. That definitely beats the cupboard under the
That's better
stairs.
than the airing cupboard, yes.
Wow, you two, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you. We've come to the end of our time, though I feel like, gosh, I could talk to you two about art for ages. And it's really lovely when I think about it, actually, and I reflect on what we've ended up talking about. It's quite telling, the fact that we're coming together with all these different art forms, and having you two coming at one piece of writing, but from two different directions, kind of really helps bring all of that full circle of experience with it. So thank you so much for coming along. And Claire, do tell us where we can get the book and where we can find the audiobook.
Well, all the usual places. I would obviously encourage everybody to try and buy it from a local bookshop, particularly if it's here in Cornwall. So I know various ones are stocking it. I can't list them all, but if they're not, you can just order it in via whichever your local bookshop is, and the audiobook in all the same places as well. Pretty much everywhere, I think, if you ask for it, they can get it in for you if they haven't got it in already.
So try your local bookshop for Zed and the Cormorant.
Definitely try that first, without a doubt, yeah.
And if you need someone in your ear, I can't recommend Sophie more for listening to the audiobook of Zed and the Cormorant as well.
I just wanted to say one more thing, actually, about the actual production of the book, because I think it's such a beautiful book to hold. I mean, I've got it right here with me now, and, it just looks so good. And then there's the Denzel, who's this amazing character in the book. He writes, there's a book within a book, which is beautifully illustrated as well. So,
yes.
it's like, it's a treat to actually have the book in your hands. I really, and I like the feel of it, the size of it. It's really important to me how books look and how they feel.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, it's a physical experience, isn't it? And you're right, there is that beautiful melding of art forms even in the book itself. When you're talking about drawing the butterflies earlier, Claire, I was thinking of Denzel's drawings that are included in your book.
Well, they're by a wonderful illustrator who happens to live near me, but I'd not met her before, called Sally Atkins, who really rose to the challenge of not just illustrating a Norwegian myth, but illustrating the interior of Denzel's mind, because I wanted her to draw with his hands, and she did that. And then the little origami chapter headings are drawn by my stepfather, and then the cover design by Clara Smith is all paper cuts that are then photographed with shadows, and it's stunning. And Cherry and I worked really hard on getting those three elements all to work together, and I'm pleased with it as well. Really pleased with it.
Thank you. Well, thank you both, and hopefully speak to you again sometime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this season of Words in a Time of Lockdown. We'll be back in September for a brand new season, starting with a very special guest, the Writer's Block patron, one and only Sir Tim Rice. You've been listening to Words in a Time of Lockdown from the Writer's Block Cornwall. Music and sound by Jimmy Marshall of southwestsonic.com.